Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I see some of our longstanding members here and some new folks as well. So welcome. I'm Hannah Shea with World Law Group. For those of you who do not know me, I work with our practice and industry groups, energy and infrastructure being one of them, and hosting today's meeting. I just want to do a few housekeeping items before I turn it over. We do record all of our sessions and post them on the website for members to review afterward. And you'll see the Otter AI at the top of your screen that says it's live streaming or live transcript. It's not live streaming anywhere, it's just recording. And you'll also see somewhere in the participant list, Hannah's autopilot, that is AI taking notes. So just wanted to give you a heads up. If you don't have your camera on, we do encourage you to turn it on if it's possible for you, if you're not traveling from place to place. We want everyone to feel as if they are part of the discussion. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Ignacio, who is the America's co-chair for the Energy and Infrastructure Group. Ignacio.
Thank you, Hannah. Good morning and good evening to everyone. With Jeremy Blackshock, we chair this practice group, and we're glad today to have Jose Augusto from Tosini Freire. Jose Augusto is a partner at the Administrative Law Practice Group, and he's an expert in government contracts and, of course, in social infrastructure. And he's today with us. He's going to provide an introduction on the topic, and then we will open the floor to have like a roundtable, an open discussion with everybody. So we encourage everyone here in the call to step in and participate. And with this, I will let Jose Augusto to begin.
Okay, thank you very much, Ignacio. I want to thank you. I want to thank Jeremy and for the opportunity of being here in the Infrastructure and Energy Group to discuss this very interesting topic, which is social infrastructure, a matter that is starting to get a really good momentum in Brazil. And I truly believe that it's the same in other jurisdictions, according to recent research that we did in other countries to have like benchmarkings. We know that this is something that is more and more becoming common in other countries as well. So thank you. And I hope that we have a great session today discussing this very interesting matter. So if you don't mind, I will just share a couple of slides for a kickoff in our topic. Please let me know if you can see it.
It looks good, Jose.
Okay, so let's go. First of all, what is social infrastructure? I think it's a interesting question because the answer is different depending on the country and where you are. But in general, social infrastructure is connected to is a subset of the infrastructure sector and typically includes assets that accommodate essential social services. The essentiality is a feature of the social infrastructure. Normally, it's not any infrastructure that we include here because you can argue definitely that every infrastructure has a social element. For example, roads, railways, and energy, telecommunications. They all have like in a certain way that are connected to social interests. But what we're talking about here is essential social services. Those are there normally attached to the idea of social infrastructure that include hospitals, schools, prisons, as we're going to discuss further, housing, parks. Normally, what we were able to discover in our research is that normally the common features around the world include, first, its provision is originally a government obligation, something that normally local constitutions say, well, this is an obligation of the state to provide. And they can be outsourced and make like an assignment to the private sector for the performance of those activities. And second, normally it is provided to society at no cost. You don't charge like a fee or tariffs. in order to provide like a social infrastructure, social service that is comprised in this category. And as we normally, traditionally, investment and operations of social infrastructure were in the hands of the government. They were originally, depending in some, especially in the U.S., it's a bit different. Sorry. Okay. I thought there was someone that wanted to add something about it. I think it was just someone that was with the mic open. So let's move on. Traditionally, investments in social infrastructure are in the hands of the government, and they were not only the state had the obligation to provide it, but it actually did it by itself. But due to fiscal restraints that arose in the last decades around the globe, the governments had to find new arrangements in order to provide social infrastructure, and that in order to include private money, private operations in the social infrastructure. And that is true, especially true in Brazil, and I truly believe that it is also true in other jurisdictions. We can discuss that further. And what are the structures that are commonly used for social infrastructure? Normally we map three main types of structure, and of course, when we talk about PPP, private-public partnerships, we're talking about a very broad definition, and this is how it normally works in Brazil, and of course, we can further see how it works somewhere else. But they are currently here in our country, this is the most common structure adopted for social infrastructure. They are PPPs. They are long-term contracts with government assigning the development and the management of a public asset or service to a private party. And that's very important on a risk-sharing basis. It's different from a concession, a pure concession, for example, where you throw the operation and the responsibility for the private party, and they take all the risks for that. Here we're talking about a risk-sharing contract, and it is commonly associated to one, investment obligations by the private entity, especially in order to overcome the fiscal difficulties of the state, of the government, and two, public financial obligations and guarantees. In regular contracts, in regular public contracts here, normally you don't have the government offering guarantees. But in PPPs in Brazil, we have the possibility of government guaranteeing offering a guarantee in order for regarding the payment, the counterparty of the payment that is due by the government. Second, performance contracts, something that is starting to get more common in Brazil, but it's still not the general rule. In which the contractor is engaged not to operate or to develop a project, but to reach a target. You simply say, well, I am engaging you to reduce the waiting time in hospitals, for example. And no matter how you're going to do that, I don't care. I don't want to see the project. I just want to have the result. And you only be paid according to the performance that you achieve. That's still starting to get more common in Brazil. Abroad, that's we know that there are some arrangements like that. For example, the social impact bonds that we know that are common in the US and also in the UK. So this is something that we're starting to develop in our country, and they but still do not have the traction that we wanted it to have. And of course, you have the other option with the full government projects. The governments are entirely in the hands of the government. The entire funding, the performance is all in the hands of the government. They are not the more common today. Even left governments that were traditionally very pro-state and governments, they are starting to move to this scenario of PPPs and private partnership with the private sector. Okay. And social gains. When we talk about social gains, we still don't have many index or numbers that we can actually trust, we found a very interesting number from the local trust, which is an NGO from the UK, which has of course, this is over like every time you talk about social gains from infrastructure is an estimate, is not accurate number, but according to local trust in a research that was conducted in 2021, we're saying that around £1 million would result in £2 million economic and social benefits. That would include increased employment, increased health and well-being, increased GVA in local economy, reduced crime, and 1.2 million fiscal benefits. So we're not talking not talking only about social gains directly, but also a reduction of costs for the state. For example, employment, healthcare savings, employment tax and benefits, reduced fiscal costs of crime. So we talk about for every, let's say that for every pound spent, we're talking about £3 in return when we talk about social infrastructure investment. I think that, of course, again, an estimate, but it can give an idea of all the return, the gains that is investment in social infrastructure can bring for the countries that adopt it. And just to conclude, and I'll start here with a very quick hot topics that are happening in Brazil right now, and as a warm up, and of course later we can have the same discussion, and I'll be very glad to hear experience in other countries. But now in Brazil, we are using the social infrastructure scenario for different areas. Normally, as I said, normally through PPP and other arrangements, of course, but most of the projects that are being structured now by the federal government, especially, they are using the PPP model format. And we have already ongoing projects in the field of schools, prisons, green spaces, parks, hospitals, sewage systems. Those are the areas where we have very interesting experiences to share. Some of those projects were structured by Tosini. So we have, for example, if you take the examples in the right of the slide, you see that there's a big hospital in Bahia, which is conducted by a PPP, and it was one of the initiatives awarded in the Improvement on Public Service Delivery category of the United Nations Public Service Award. So some projects, they receive international money as well, especially hospitals and schools. And we concluded the first structuring of a prison system in Brazil. It was conducted by Tosini in the city of Erechim. The contract has just been signed, so we still do not have the results to show to you. But we estimate that it will open space to 1,200 prisoners. They're today allocated somewhere else. They are going to be transferred to this new prison. It will be managed by a private company under the supervision of the state. And also in Belo Horizonte, you have 37 municipal schools that are managed through PPPs. So it's a big number, and you know that the results are very interesting for those schools. We have the number of kids that leave school before the end of the school term has dramatically been reduced, which is a very interesting number. So, and what is two main topics that I want to show to you? There's especially in the funding side in Brazil. First, we have a new federal project, which is called the New PAC, the New Growth Acceleration Program, which estimates 1.7 trillion reais, which is around $340 billion in investment for several areas, with special focus on infrastructure. So it's for our local economy, for our local reality, that's a lot of money, and it should be invested until 2026. And we have the infrastructure bonds, which for international companies, international investors in our country, it's very interesting because the Brazilian government, for the first time, may authorize, in some cases, the issuance of infrastructure debentures with an exchange rate variation clause, something that was prohibited until recently in Brazil. And second, there's a zero rate of withholding income tax when you on interest right from foreign loans obtained through issuance of securities international market. Normally, when you pay Brazilian companies pay interest to international funding, we would withhold 15 to 30% of income tax. Now there's an exemption for that. So we have a lot of international investors that are looking into it, are seeing that as an opportunity to enter the Brazilian market. And that will all be helpful to fund the social infrastructure in our country. So this is an initial overview of social infrastructure. And now maybe it's a good time to start discussions about your countries, your jurisdictions, what among everything, all the information that I brought, what is common in your jurisdictions as well, what is different would be, I think it's a good time for us to have a discussion on that. Thank you.
Well, I could start in Chile. We have a different scale, but a similar experience as you are having in Brazil. I would say that by the end of the 90s, we have a law that promotes concessions, public concessions, and we initially started by basically highways. So most of the highways and roads that have been constructed in Chile have been through that structure of public concessions that the government provides the construction of the highways to privates. They finance it, and they have the right to charge tolls for 20 years, 25 years, etc., maintaining the quality of the road. And that has been a system that has been working pretty well in Chile. And on recent years, we have moved something similar, what you have explained, Jose. For example, prisons in Chile, penitentiaries, all that program has been financing with this private-public structure. I was recently reviewing the most current projects, and there's also, for example, tsunami early warning. That's something that in Chile, as you know, we have a very big coast, and we have a big risk of tsunami, and that has been also financed with this type of concessions, public and private. There is a catalog that I could share later with all of you of some projects that are being developed in Chile with this type of concessions for 2024 and 2025. Those are quite important public bids. Usually in Chile, you make some kind of agreements between companies in order to participate in this kind of transactions. So it may be also interest some of your clients in order to see if there is some interest in participating in the construction of sport. Or also airports. In Chile, small airports and big airports are being developed not with the government funds, but this type of concessions that they go public for, I don't know, 20 years, 15 years, and the privates have the concessions for those years, and they charge some kinds of fees for that purpose. So in Chile has been we have had very good results with this type of structures and construction, and obviously allow the government to spend that money in other priorities of social interest.
Yeah, very, very interesting, Sergio. We know that I heard of some initiatives in Chile, also in Peru, another Latin American jurisdiction that we saw that those projects moving. And we normally, is it a mix of public and private money, or is all private money? Is it free? Is it something that you can build together between government and companies, or how is it normally structured?
Usually structured that the government basically designs the project, the target to be constructed. There will be some kind of public bidding process that they supervise. And then the construction, management, administration, and maintenance of that project, airport, highway, whatever, it is controlled by the private entities who basically they have the right to receive the fee, in many cases, the toll or right for the manager for a certain period of time. Usually it could be 20 years, 25 years. And I would say that most of the important infrastructure in Chile of airports, highways, things like that, then has been built through this system. So construction is performed by privates, financing by privates, and everything is supervised by the government, basically. And there have been some conflicts in highways when they have the right to increase the fee of the highways. And obviously, the public doesn't agree with that. There are always tensions and negotiations in which the government has to intervene. So that's something that every 5 years we are facing that type of process.
Sergio, is there any requirement for local participation in these bids? I mean that foreign investor should partner with a local company, or they can participate directly without any local partner.
I have seen there are not legal limitations. Depends of the size of the infrastructure, the expertise that they need, but they usually partner. Foreigners partner with a local company that knows how things basically work in Chile. Sometimes even in big projects, the government likes to have foreigners here because basically all the guarantee of the parent involved. So there are legal structures that they require that the guarantees in order to, in case that there's some problem, they could go to the parent company. So we have seen everything, but there's no legal provision, and basically it also depends on the bidding basis. The bidding basis depend the nature of the contract, basically.
Thanks, Sergio.
To say what I heard from Brazil is very similar to what we have in Argentina in terms of the structure that you mentioned. Unfortunately, the PPP project that was very ambitious law that was enacted some years ago failed. It was not very successful. It began as the first tranche was for railroads. We had hospitals. The second tranche, third tranche were railroads. But that belongs more what we will consider in Argentina as economic infrastructure, which is in opposition to social infrastructure. Social infrastructure is what you mentioned about approaching the basic needs of the population and improving their quality of life. Economic infrastructure turns more to assisting a specific, I would say, jurisdiction, a town, a city, to become more competitive in terms of business. At the end of the day, it will be also social, but not so straightforward as it is the social infrastructure. Now, Argentina has a need of foreign investment. So basically what you have now is a full government contract, and is the government fully involved, which is social infrastructure. And what we have is a legal figure, which is the fiduciary trust. I don't know if you have that in Brazil, which is the government implementing and setting up trust for many areas of the social needs, but became a sort of company within the structure of the government. They are more efficient in terms that they don't have to undergo all the processes that you need for investing and making decisions. It's like a company, have their own investments, so the funding is conducted from the National Treasury, but also from their own investment, their own acquisition of assets, sale of assets. And this permitted the country to obtain not a very high level of investment in the region in terms of economic infrastructure, but definitely a very important levels of infrastructure and social infrastructure, whatever, schools, education, water and sanitation, energy, um, I don't know, jails. Uh, but I don't know if it's in Brazil you have something similar to that because this seems to be very successful in Argentina so far.
Yeah, I think what you described as a public trust in Argentina, we have state-controlled companies, like state companies like as estatais,
Okay.
which are controlled by the government. And if you go back to the 80s and 90s, most of the infrastructure and social services provided to the population were done through public companies. During the 90s, most of them were privatized. For example, in the telecommunication companies, the energy companies, the road, the companies that were in charge of roads and railways, they were airports. They were belong to the government structure. Now, especially from the 90s, it has all been assigned to the private sector. But for some social services, they're still in the hands of the government. For example, sanitation. And most of the sewage system in Brazil is operated by public companies. We have a new sanitation act that was passed in the Congress 3 years ago, and which encourages more private investment. But still, most of this sanitation system is in the hands of government, which helps to explain why we still have 50% of Brazilian population without access to sewage systems. So the idea of bringing more private money has everything to do with that, with the idea of improving the quality. But today, I think we have, in some cases, the infrastructure required for a given service is so expensive that you cannot simply fund that through tariffs or fees charged from the user. In those situations, you have PPPs and public companies involved because you need also public money involved, because simply doing that through fees or tariffs charged by users is not enough. In those cases, it's very common that you have like what I would call like a public trust, a public fund that offers guarantees that will help to fund the investment. That's for example the case for metro systems in several cities in Brazil. For you to put together an infrastructure of metro systems is so expensive. The capex, the capital expenditure is so high that you need only the money that the end user pays every day is not enough. So you need public money. In those cases, we use a lot of PPPs and also private public companies to operate. So yeah, that's also for some specific sectors, it's a reality also in Brazil.
Yeah, because you're mentioning our project, which are basically relevant project, big projects, and I don't think we're going to have private investors covering the whole total cost of those projects.
Yes, yes, and normally, normally one thing that our PPP Act was enacted in 2005, and because regular public contracts, they did not allow the offering of a public guarantee. So many private investors say, well, I'm not entering that because most of the money will come from the government. So if I don't have guarantees that I will make the investment and the government will actually pay its part, I will not enter. So our PPPs now, they allow the possibility of the government offering a guarantee of payment, something that can be done through public bonds or public assets. So this is something that really changed the landscape in terms of investment in certain areas.
Yeah, what we have is in those cases, for example, more the local governments, the provincial governments get involved as borrowers, and we had the federal government as guarantors, but just that. Because since we have a sort of co-participation of taxes in Argentina, the federal government knows that if he has to pay because the provincial government failed to pay, it is going to withhold the co-participation. That is a lot of money that is transferred for the promises on a monthly basis. So, and it gives the counterparty a more, let's say, an important guarantee, because it's now the federal government who is, behind the payment of this project. At least is a good experience in Argentina so far.
Just to follow up on that, as Sebastian said, we had and we still have a very good regulatory framework for PPPs. The projects failed because of lack of financing. And one of the challenges that Argentina faces is that these guarantees that the government has to give in order to promote the projects and make them, feasible, created a political problem. Because at the end of the day, any guarantee by the government is sovereign debt and requires the Congress to step in and approve each project. So any project under PPP required, at the end of the day, a Congress approval. I don't know whether this type of situation happened in other jurisdictions, but I think we've been talking about Brazil, Chile, and Argentina. That is like the southern corner of the world. Maybe someone else from Europe or Latin America or Asia, Australia would like to jump in and elaborate on their experience.
Yeah, I don't know if you want me to talk a bit about my experience of PPPs from the UK perspective, but I could also talk a little bit to the other jurisdictions where we've got live PPP type projects at the moment and where I've got experience of working. Social infrastructure, I've traditionally understood to mean anything which relates to basically public services. So in the UK originally, that would have been health, education, certain types of government accommodation. And then I suppose the debate would be whether or not you include things like waste, water, and probably not highways in social infrastructure, even though they all serve a public good. I mean, basically, we've had PPPs in the UK under the original UK private finance initiative going back to the 1990s. And actually, a lot of the work that I'm doing at the moment is to do with the back end of those projects, which are now coming to the expiry of their life, and where we're having to wrestle with the challenge of the don't want to say inadequacies, but the slightly high level way in which the required condition of the assets and the process to hand over the assets and procure replacement services when those PPPs expired. That problem is sort of starting to manifest. And I think the one challenge around it is that PPPs are obviously typically entered into by thinly capitalized special purpose companies. And there are questions over what resources those entities might have in order to fulfill the obligations that are still outstanding at the expiry of the contract, in terms of the obligations that are outstanding at the expiry date and the condition of the assets that are to be handed over. I personally have also been involved in PPPs in Canada, where Gowling are quite active as well. But going back to the late 2000s and the early 2010s, Canada had a very large program of social infrastructure PPPs, which were basically procured using the UK standardization of project contracts guidance, but with minor adaptations in order to reflect local law requirements. And there were a number of very successfully delivered projects in Canada, a lot of them using private placement bond financing rather than traditional bank financing or clubs of banks, which has been the more common route that's been used for social infra PPPs in the UK anyway. And at the moment, we are active. Some of it is social infrastructure and some of it is roads and sort of larger transport infrastructure. But in the Middle East, in particular, Saudi Arabia has a very large program of PPPs at the moment. which are all being procured using what is essentially the Canadian documents. So they've effectively taken as precedents the UK models as adapted for use in North America, and that's being sort of adopted as international best practice for the use of PPPs. So we've recently been involved in projects to do with worker accommodation associated with the construction of NEOM, 5 PPPs for worker accommodation, which were delivered using, it was all Islamic financing as well. And we also have some live mandates acting for the National Centre for Privatization in Saudi Arabia to do with roads and the construction of PPP roads. I won't go off on too much of a tangent in relation to roads, because I think it's debatable whether they're social infrastructure or not, but there are multiple of different models that can be used in terms of the extent of the usage risk. Whether or not you have a pure availability-based project with the public sector taking the risk on usage and toll income, which I believe is the model they're going to use in Saudi Arabia, and certainly is the model which has been used in Kenya and other places where it's been deployed, as compared to tolling or shadow tolling projects of the type that were used typically for projects in Europe, and certainly for projects in mainland Europe. PPP roads in the UK tended to be either availability based or based on shadow tolling, whereas in mainland Europe, I think there were a number that were done on a concession basis with a full transfer, in terms of the risk associated with how many road users actually paid the toll. And there were a number of projects that had challenges and had to be sort of fairly extensively restructured in places like Spain in the early 2010s, just as a consequence of the road numbers never matching up to the expected levels that form the basis of the original finance packages. But yeah, there's a multiplicity of different kind of threads you could go down in terms of the things that we've witnessed or the things that we've experienced in terms of the effective use of PPPs for social infrastructure. At the moment, there is a presumption against using them in the UK, with the exception of it's being used, something which is called the direct procurement for customers, which is a quasi PPP route, which is being used for certain major water projects. That and a couple of road and hospital projects which are being let by devolved administrations in Wales are pretty much the only things which are being procured under pure PPPs in the UK at the moment. But we are seeing PPP-like structures used in a number of sectors which are not led by the government, not led by the public sector.
And Dominic, thank you. That was very, very interesting. The UK, especially Brazil, has the UK as a reference when we talk about regulation and transfer of assignment of certain responsibilities for the private sector. And so when you say to me that PPPs today are not being not as trendy as they used to be, it brings the question: what are today the normal structures that the kind of contract you normally use for this kind of infrastructure today? Is it like regular concession, or what do you normally use?
I mean, the reality is that basically, since the UK moved away from doing PPPs and looking at the Eurostat rules in terms of the way in which it structured asset transfers on its PPPs, since sorry, I'm trying to think how many prime ministers we've had since the prime minister who brought an end to it. It might be as many as 5, even though that's only a 6-7 year period. Since that came to an end, you have effectively seen a significant slowing down in expenditure on infrastructure in the UK generally. And actually, that has been the pattern under the current government in its various forms over most of the last 14, 15 years. What you've tended to see is a large number of projects which have been delivered just using traditional design and build structures. So, for example, we advised the government on what was originally going to be a PPP to build a tunnel under Stonehenge, the World Heritage Site. That was originally going to be procured as a DBFO PPP. After the program was cancelled, that was procured as a straight design and build contract. And we're still actually waiting for the start button to be pressed on that. that effectively the contracts were signed 2 years ago, but it's still awaiting the conclusion of the planning process and appeals which have been made through the planning process because of the sensitivity of the site and the sensitivity of a number of vested interest stakeholders. And then in relation to more things like hospitals or schools, it has again just been traditional construction under frameworks with services being provided under facilities management frameworks, which are mostly in place at a national level. There is an established set of construction frameworks for categories of social infrastructure and for the provision of services to social infrastructure. But I think it's fair to say that the absence of PPPs of one variety or another has led to a general slowdown in the rate of investment in social infrastructure in the UK, and just increases the potential deficit there is there in terms of the required level of investment there might be over the next 10 years. It remains open to question whether a change of government in the UK might see a change in that structure. PPPs, and in particular the profits made by certain organisations on the very earliest PPPs in the 1990s, remain hugely controversial, as they are somewhat unfairly seen as being inefficient uses of public money, or resulting in resulting in super profits which are seen as being undesirable. And so for that reason, there is huge political nervousness about making big commitments to bring PPPs back and to involving the private sector in the delivery of public services in the same way.
Yeah, it makes it special because the UK has a very mature infrastructure, so it makes sense that you don't need all that much money investing in infrastructure as we do in South America, for example, or other countries. So yes, the time I spent 1 year living in the UK, and I can tell the difference between the infrastructure of the two countries. So yes, we were in different levels in terms of challenges for social infrastructure, definitely.
No.
Well, look, I might just mention the Australian experience briefly. We very closely followed the English model, I think, with following a similar pattern from many of our other speakers tonight, a lot of privatisations, sale of ports and roads, public transport assets, so underground, local public transport and interstate rail. We then had a period of reasonably substantial PPP financing of social infrastructure, in particular prisons, until that caused some political issues, and hospitals have essentially been the only real remaining PPP model in Australia. But again, like the English experience, I think there was a bit of excess profit taking. One of the reasons, though, that I don't think's had a mention so far, but certainly was quite influential in the Australian experience, was in the move away from state ownership of businesses and assets, and that was to control the power of the unions, particularly over our left-wing governments. They had an excess amount of power, and the privatisation of those assets and the ability to involve private companies in construction and management of those assets was utilised as a way to, I think, minimise the influence and the increased cost that intense union activity from the workers played into a couple of our states in particular. We have moved, I think, largely to an outsourced design and construct model here in Australia. There's a couple of exceptions for some sporting infrastructure and convention centres and other like things, but largely we've gone back to a more traditional procurement model. Financed either through the equity markets, or more typically with a mix of corporate bonds and other tax favoured investment bond models. but it does sound like the experience has been reasonably similar to everywhere else, and certainly the PPP model is less popular now. I think, you know, in a high interest rate environment, we might see governments move back to a more traditional PPP model. But again, I think the political unpopularity of the model with some companies taking outsized profits has calmed the excitement, and we're seeing governments perhaps move back into a privatisation mode again. They're getting a little more inventive with the sale and partnering of risk sharing and financing, particularly digital build outs and transformation. They're doing that in partnership with private companies and selling concessions in a range of service areas that have traditionally been seen as purely government. Motor vehicle licensing, number plates, that sort of that sort of thing.
I have one question for Dominic and Jeremy. I think that you particularly mentioned, Dominic, that you are at a time in which many of these PPP are reaching to the end of the term, and that is a situation that is not experienced, at least in Latin America, because many of the PPP initiatives are still ongoing. What are the challenges that you face at the final term of the PPPs? What are the issues that may arise between the government and the private parties?
I'll probably put them under sort of 3 or so main headings. The first is around the drafting of the contracts in terms of how they both provide for the process to be run in the lead up to expiry, and how clear they are or aren't on the required condition of the assets at the expiry date. So, for example, in the context of hospitals, during the operational phase, they have unavailability criteria where it's extremely prescriptive, effectively saying a room has to be a certain temperature, it has to have certain equipment in it in order for it to be available, and for there not to be deductions associated with the area being unavailable under the terms of the PPP. Whereas hospital PPPs in the UK typically just included a single line that stated at the expiry date, the contracts, so the hospital must be in NHS Estate Code Condition B. And I have the reference document somewhere that is by reference to, but effectively it's a reference document that hasn't been published since 2002, 2003, which had an extremely high level way of categorizing whether an entire facility was in Condition A, Condition B, or Condition C. So it's very difficult on the basis of a description like that to identify what the service provider's obligations are in terms of the condition that it's meant to hand the facility back in, because it's recognized that you're not expected to hand back an as new facility which is built as per contemporary design standards and health design codes. But the flip side to it is you're not expected to just build a facility and then maintain it and gradually run it down over 30 years either. And then the two other issues to do with that are the process that's provided for under the contract, how early you start as the public sector surveying the facility in order to assess its condition and what work is required in the lead up to the expiry of the contract. The cost of surveying a large PPP facility can be very significant. It can be hundreds of thousands of pounds in and of itself, just doing the data capture exercise and then converting that into a report to identify all of the areas where remedial work is required. And then the two other pieces to that are, typically the project company is a thinly capitalized special purpose company, which is owned by PPP equity investors. By the time you get to the handback phase, typically the senior debt that was used to build the facility or undertake the refurbishment work at the outset has been repaid. So there is not a funder involved, which means that a number of things you would have in place for the benefit of the funders, like maintenance reserves accounts, may or may not still be in place when you start to look at the handback process. and that potentially means that you are trying to get a company which has got, one asset, which is its PPP contract, but with less than a year or 18 months to run on its PPP contract, trying to get it to undertake works that might have a value that significantly exceeds the remaining amounts that are payable under that contract is quite a difficult potential risk for the public sector, and how to best intervene in that situation. And then, I think the other piece around it is just the practicality in terms of usually the expiry of a PPP means handover of a facility, transition of a number of staff who are employed in the delivery of services at the facility. There are European conventions around the transfer of employment on the transfer of an undertaking that would kick in, but it's around how that process is managed smoothly and effectively to ensure that the organization, the public sector organization with a PPP, doesn't find itself floundering and basically suddenly having a lot of responsibility for the operation of an asset that it's done very little to operate in the preceding 20, 25 years, meaning that you may not have the management and operational skills in order to run the facility immediately after the expiry date.
Thank you, Dominic. The last point you mentioned is particularly interesting to us. What happens in Argentina many times is when you reach an end of a concession, not even a PPP, the government automatically extends the period for 1 year in order to get prepared to take over that concession, because they did nothing prior to that.
And that's normal with concession contracts. It's slightly more difficult to do with PPPs because of the way that they're structured, in the sense that, in a PPP, the amount that the PPP contractor is charging in terms of its unitary payment is not just the concession fee plus a 15% margin. It's many, many multiples of it. So even if the PPP contractor is able to agree terms with its service providers to continue providing the service for another year, it causes all sorts of complications in terms of both the liabilities in terms of the condition of the facility at expiry, procurement law, and also the commercial terms on which a provider may or may not be prepared to consider extension. So we are in a number of the jurisdictions where we've got kind of new PPPs trying to work through these things and identify ways in which it could be addressed better than it is by the typical language that was used to let these projects back in the 2000s in particular. Good.
Just one final comment from my side. One major concern for social infrastructure projects here is about public opinion, because Brazil is not normally used to see a private company operating a hospital, operating a school, or even a prison system. It still looks odd in the eyes of the population to see a private company making money out of this kind of project. So we face a lot of difficulties in while we were structuring the prison system of Erechim, the one that we worked on, and during the public hearings was a nightmare. We had all these unions and associations of citizens from the local places who said, well, you cannot, the state cannot give up its task of guaranteeing security. That should be in the hands of the state. We have a massive riots in the prisons. The companies will be corrupted by the crime organizations. That was really bad. So I think in addition to all the challenges in terms of financing and in structuring it in a reasonable way, we still have to overcome the matter of the public opinion, which is still there's a lot to the population still not have the culture of seeing companies making money out of social projects, like probably in the US, UK, and other jurisdictions, that's more common and more in the DNA of the population. So something that I think we're in a better position now than we were like 10, 15 years ago, especially because even the left governments like Lula administration now, they are pro PPPs and concessions. They just want to they just avoid the word privatization. Privatization still have a very ideologic content, and they avoid that word. Well, we're not selling assets, we're not selling public, we're just outsourcing, just like assigning the obligation to perform to private companies, but it's still a public asset. They use that speech, but in the end, the final result is the same. So just want to touch on that topic about the public opinion, which is an interesting one here in Brazil.
Anyone else would like to make like a final comment? Okay, then I would like to thank you on behalf of Hannah, Jeremy, and myself to Jose Augusto for proposing this topic, for taking the lead to make the introduction and moderating the whole session, and also to everyone in this call for participating. I mean, well, I don't know if you know, but our original practice group was related to energy, and now it's energy and infrastructure. So it was great to begin dealing with topics related to infrastructure, and we hope to continue doing so in the next meetings that we will organize. So we're gonna invite you to continue participating in these meetings. I don't know, Jeremy, if you would like to say anything else, or Hannah.
Oh no, I think you've put it well, Ignacio. It's great to see everyone and to start the conversation. I look forward to seeing you all at a future meeting. Over to you, Hannah, to wind things up perfectly on time.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you guys for joining today. And we had some new folks that participated, and we really appreciate that. If you have any ideas for topics that you want to discuss, please let me know, or Jeremy, or Ignacio, or we're happy to schedule a meeting to organize that. I will circulate a list of contact information for the people who did attend today, along with Jose Augusto's slides, so that you have that if you want to continue the conversation or reach out to one another with additional questions. But with that, thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day or evening, wherever you are.